So welcome everybody to the BioRender Learning Hub's top 5 design tips for better grant figures. So for those that have joined our previous webinars, this will be kind of an extension of those. We're going to be covering some of the basics that are really worth repeating and just kind of getting a brush up on, as well as some really core new tips that we'd love to share with you and I think will be very important as you go through your figure making endeavor. Okay, a little bit of background about myself. My name is Shiz. If we haven't met already, one of the co-founders of BioRender, and my background is in medical and biological illustration. And actually, on that note, maybe I'll just introduce the team real quick. We actually have Joe, Cindy, and Jerry from the BioRender team in the chat, in the Zoom chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask away in the Zoom Q&A. If you've noticed, there's also kind of a option for when you're discussing in the chat room there to use all panelists or all panelists and attendees. So if you want to kind of share your question so that it's visible to the rest of the room, you can go ahead and use that as an option. Otherwise, if you want to remain anonymous, you can actually ask a question or describe something to the panelists, which will kind of come to the BioRender team, and that's by selecting all panelists only. Okay, great. So sorry, a little bit of housekeeping there. Let's get started. So just wanted to show this because, this exemplifies that we're no stranger to creating really complex figures in kind of a small amount of space. And when I think of grant figures in particular, that's kind of what resonates with me, is this challenge of kind of including as much information as we can into a really itty-bitty space. Because I think for the most part, a lot of grants restrict the size or at least restrict the content so that, there's a trade-off between how much text, how much figure, how to balance that ratio. So we'll kind of go through some tips of what we've learned over the last decade of creating complex figures like this. I created this using, I think, a combination of Photoshop, Illustrator, watercolor. So we're not going to go into how to make the illustration from scratch, but of course, using BioRender as a tool. And basically, that's all the tools you'll really need to accomplish many of the grant figures going forward, hopefully. This is another example of a huge endeavor we did at National Geographic when I was working there. Again, no stranger to balancing how much content to include in sort of a certain amount of real estate. In the print world, print space is really expensive. If you think about, obviously print to paper, that in itself is an expensive commodity. But also, if you're selling advertising space, companies spend millions of dollars just by measuring the square inch of the size of their advertisement. So clearly, there's a lot of trade-offs there in the design world, thinking about how much information to include, most of the times what not to include. So again, we're going to be drawing from some of those principles you've learned over the years and then apply it to grant figures in particular today. And by the way, stop me if my audio doesn't sound good or if it cuts out or if it slows down. I can repeat anything you need. So of course, the sort of sad state of biology today is that this is the quality of a lot of the figures you'll see, unfortunately. And that's just the nature of not having the right tools, the resources, perhaps the right reference images, or time, really. You'll have to whip together these figures. Usually at the very end of putting together a grant, you're kind of scrambling to make the figures at the 24th hour. So, kind of a reaction to that, of course. And our mission here at BioRender is to empower all of you to create really fast, beautiful, professional figures, really in a fraction of the time. So what I'd love to do today is kind of go through some of the theory of how to make a really beautiful grant figure. And then we'll kind of toggle between this presentation and then BioRender itself, the application, to apply some of that theory in practice. And I know there's a kind of a cross-section of individuals of today in the room that have used BioRender and haven't. Pretty well balanced, it looks like. So for many of you, we'll get to see this for the first time. And many of you who are BioRender veterans will kind of go through some of the new features we've launched recently. So of course, some common use cases of BioRender are for grant applications, publications, presentations, really sort of the entire scientific endeavor, especially when it comes to communication. So thinking about, grant figures in particular, how can we improve those figures? Of course, there's going to be interesting considerations compared to publications, graphical abstracts, posters, slide decks. Grants present their own unique challenges. Here's one reason, again, kind of that balance of that overwhelming amount of information in a small amount of space. I think for the NIH grants in particular, there's something called a specific aims page, where you'll often have to cram in a bunch of information. And then again, that trade-off of how much space do you leave for the figure versus a text. Of course, we're biased in that we think figures should speak, thousands of words and thereby reduce the amount of text you need. And if you're lucky enough to get away with something schematic like this, now this is just a mock-up, so this is not a real image to grant comparison, but we've placed in here some simplified figures, not as challenging if you're just talking about, maybe a simple flow diagram. The challenge really comes with something like this, where you're going to have to match up graphs, data, organic squishy things in biology, again, in a very small amount of space. And how do you do that effectively? So here are the 5 tips that we've kind of collated. I think like most webinars, we want to go through probably 50 or so, but these 5 kind of floated to the top as the most important, I think, and probably just enough for you to digest in the next, say, 40 minutes. So 1 is optimizing flow of information, very, very important. Number 2, color. I could probably talk about this for days. Really, really, really important. We'll go through some of the basics as well as some considerations specific to science diagrams. Space-saving tips. Again, the challenge of creating a figure in a small amount of space. We've got some tips there to share with you. We've also have seen a lot of figures using keys or legends. So there are appropriate times to use those and not to use them. And then putting it all into context. Okay. And then earlier, I've actually launched a poll to ask, who in the room has used BioRender and who hasn't. It looks like we only got a fraction of the attendees here, but that's okay. Sorry if you weren't able to add in your answers, but I'm sharing those with you now so you can see who else is in the room. Again, looks like we're pretty evenly divided with those who have used BioRender and who hasn't. Pretty cool to see all of your colleagues and what field of research they're in. And apologies again that quite a few in the other category, so we'll do better there to kind of expose some of those subfields next time. And then those of you who have an upcoming grant or scholarship deadline, pretty distributed there for when you've got a deadline coming up. So hopefully some of these tips will be relevant for you as you prepare those figures. And I guess for my teammates, any questions, comments that we can elaborate on before we continue? Looks like we're doing okay. Sounds good. All right, let's dive in. Okay, so 5 tips for better grant figures. Number 1 is optimizing flow of information. Now, some of you have seen us talk about this before, but it's really worth repeating. Thinking about, the directionality of information, it really can't be too creative. So there are kind of hard and fast rules that we're unfortunately tied to. And I'd say these 8 generally sum up, one of those that you should follow with your figure. We wouldn't recommend mixing and matching too much within these. It really should follow at most, I would say, 2 of these combined. So your image may have a sort of unidirectional flow, so left to right, up to down, and cyclical, of course, for those that are kind of, looping or maybe kind of a never-ending cycle. A Z shape for maybe a protocol or a timeline or something that's really long and you can't fit it all into one row. M shape is a little more specific to maybe poster building. You've probably seen that in sort of the intro results all the way to the conclusion. L shape is if you want to get a little ambitious and have kind of a main image in the center there, and then kind of have smaller subsidiary images around. Fork shape is, I've seen this before where maybe you'll have, one experiment or endeavor have two aims or specific aims. So that's helpful to have that fork kind of shape or composition. Or if maybe you have, two outcomes. Same goes for the vertical kind of fork shape. Of course, this can then extend into 3-pronged forks, or however many prongs you need. But as long as that flow is directional and not kind of curving around. Okay, and I'll explain better kind of by example in the next slides. So here's a neat example of something we've shown in a past webinar. Is an example kind of volunteered by one of your colleagues. And what I'm going to do is just kind of draw over the flow of this diagram. So if we start here, I think this is the beginning. It's not numbered or anything, so I probably would, number it. Hopefully you can see my squiggly mouse marks. If you were to follow the flow of information, it's going from here down this way and around. So we're already kind of breaking a couple of rules here as far as it's not quite cyclical, not quite linear. There is sort of a fork in the road here, but my eye had a bit of a hard time following the story, especially because we also have these other arrows that are not really following the general inertia of the information. So what we did instead was to change that up a little bit and create a new flow. So now with that basically exact same information, cleaned it up a little bit where it's kind of, unidirectional there. And then we're following that sort of Z pattern. So this is much easier to follow, much cleaner. And you can see here, there's a bit of a fork in the road, but we made that as kind of an afterthought. It didn't deserve its own number almost, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all those steps. It was kind of an afterthought, and we had to make a decision as to whether this was worth granting its own number or just kind of letting it hang off to the side. You're really going to have to pick your main story and let the others kind of float off to the side a little bit, just in case you lose your reviewer's attention. We can't risk that. You really want to make sure they get the main point of your story right away. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. Just going to go back into presenter mode. And then that kind of leads me into this idea of the principle of proximity. So when you're kind of going through creating a diagram that is stepwise, and this is very common, steps 1 to 6 is how you arrive at something, or maybe a pathway has, steps 1 to 8 or something, in order to be transcribed, translated into proteins, all of that. So the principle of proximity is really important when you are trying to figure out, what is the composition you want to go with for your figure. It makes it really easy if sort of the number, the step title, I guess we can call it, as well as the description and the image to describe the description is tightly associated with each other. Here we've kind of shown a cyclical and a linear formation, kind of like, carts on a train. And in practice, you should be able to rearrange them almost like Post-it notes. So if they are able to be rearranged very easily, kind of like sheets of paper on a desk, then it makes it much easier to kind of create that flow. Also, for the eye, it makes it much easier to associate all the elements for one step with that step in particular. You don't want, the label of one step bleeding into sort of the next step so that you don't really know, where those steps are demarcated. I hope that makes sense. Here it is, kind of digging in a little bit deeper here about the principle of proximity. So what you're seeing here is very typical, A, B, C, D. You're noticing that the letter C is kind of encroaching on the space of step A. Same goes for B. And what we would do as sort of a design trick is to visualize what that would look like if it was actually just made of boxes. Remove the graphics as a variable and try to think of it in really basic principles. So if I were to trace the images in a box, this is what the arrangement would look like. Clearly not evenly spaced, and they're kind of not following that sort of proximity rule. So sometimes it takes just literally a little bit of nudging to kind of get that proper proximity and distance between each step. Now, I know I'm belaboring the point here, but this, for some reason, is one of the worst offenders or the biggest mistakes we see in grant images, publication figures. It's literally just the alignment and the respect for that negative space in between steps like this. So try to keep that in mind. If you're having trouble visualizing how much buffer room you need between, just trace it with some boxes, whether it's in your head or on PowerPoint or BioRender, whatever it is. This will hopefully help you rearrange those boxes. And here's an example. I think at this point, I'll probably toggle over to BioRender to kind of show you how I'd fix up this figure in particular, which I think is quite nice actually already. It's available as a template in BioRender. Of course, not this version. There's a couple of things here that I'd fix, again, following that principle of proximity and some alignment issues there. So I'm going to toggle over to BioRender. For those brand new to BioRender, this is what it looks like. This is the UI or the user interface. This is my account or my demo account. So it's going to look a little different for you versus your colleague versus myself. What I'm going to do is jump into my folders here on the left. And this is my folder that I've set up for this demo. And I'm going to open up that figure. Just going to resize my browser here a little bit so you can see. All right, so really quick, I think first thing I would do is, we haven't talked about it yet, but kind of giving a sense of hierarchy to the text. So I think these are the titles. They deserve a much larger font size, first of all, so that those can be very readily read from the get-go. So right away, that's differentiated. In fact, I like to differentiate, text to labels, to action items. All those things should have their own kind of category of text size. That's already looking a little bit better. We could even go a little bigger, but I think I'll keep it like that for now. Of course, like we talked about before, numbering your steps is super important. So in BioRender, there's this really nifty insert shape function, and our team has set up these pre-made numbers and letters. So if you prefer letters, that's fine too. You can create a letter or go in later and fix that to a number. They're basically editable text and shapes, but it kind of creates this perfect circle where you can create these kind of numbered steps. I'm just alt dragging, by the way. It might be different for a PC. I think it's Control or Command drag. Sorry, I'm on a Mac, so I don't know the shortcuts for a PC. If you do want shortcuts, though, there's this little keyboard shortcut cheat sheet. So you can get really fast in BioRender by using these kind of shortcuts. Okay, so already looking a little bit better. Maybe I'll even turn on my rulers and put out some grid lines here, just so I know that everything is going to be aligned. Again, respecting that kind of negative space. Let's see here, maybe that's enough space. Hopefully you can see how I'm placing the grid lines down. I'm just clicking on the ruler. And what I'm going to do is just, tuck everything in a little bit. This 2 is kind of encroaching on the space for number 1. So if I lay down a couple more grid lines, all I have to do is kind of color in the lines. Maybe move this over a little bit, like so. And I like laying down grid lines because, again, it kind of lets me just get a little creative with everything else going on in the canvas without having to think about, am I following the alignment properly? There we go. And same goes for this set of information. I'll tuck it in. Maybe I'll even move this down a little bit so there's enough room between the rows. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's hit preview. Yeah, already looking much, much better. So what I'm going to do is export this figure. I'm just going to do 72 DPI for now because I don't need it to be super high res. It's going to download to my desktop, and then I'll pop back over to my Google slide deck and then insert, which is just basically, again, selecting from my desktop here. So if you compare the two, looking left and right, much, much cleaner. If I kind of scale it to size, much easier to follow. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I could have probably even left a little more room between the two horizontal rows here. But, again, following that sort of rule of proximity, you could imagine 1, 2, 3, 4 on its own post-it, and I can now maybe make it a linear format. I'm using kind of a Z formation here as far as the, if I go back to what we talked about, it's a Z like this. So that's looking pretty good. Great. Okay. So tip number 2, this is probably my favorite topic to cover. And again, that's the idea of color principles and really mastering this so that you almost don't have to think about, is this colorblind friendly or is there enough contrast? So let's dive into that. For color, there are kind of 3 dimensions, and you don't have to memorize these, but just to kind of understand, maybe you've taken a painting course before or a design course, but I think 90% of most artists' work and learnings are about color and mastering value of color. So first of all, the hue, which is just the name of the color. So we all know this: yellow, orange, red, purple. Value, I don't think there's a word for different values, but it's basically the lightness or darkness of a color. If you go kind of up and down this vertical row. And then the chroma is actually the saturation of that color. So if you think about it in terms of maybe a highlighter is the far right, and then pastel shades are to the left, or kind of like a Valencia Instagram filter kind of reduces the saturation. So those are the 3 kind of dimensions if you think of it kind of on an XYZ axis of color. So this is all probably jargon to you, which is okay. We'll kind of put it in practice now. I'm just taking this opportunity to talk about my favorite painter, living painter, probably the best realist, classical realist artist of our generation, Richard Schmid. And I bet you when you look at this painting that your eye is probably going in this kind of a fashion, between the flowers in this kind of a format. And the reason is that the color saturation, the contrast, and the level of detail, those 3 things are what really drives your eye to certain parts of an image. And that's, of course, the way nature intends it, because plants that rely on pollinators, their flowers have to be the highest contrast, the highest chroma, the brightest colors, the highest contrast, and everything else kind of has to fade into the distance. So I've converted this painting to black and white just to show you that if you remove color as a variable, that saturation, or that value rather, kind of still gives that kind of that flow of information, I guess. So I'm going to use this analogy a lot, is, thinking about your figure almost like an artist would their paintings. If it was a still life, what parts of your figure are kind of the flower of the plant or the buds? That's how I'd love you to think about approaching your figure. Another principle that I won't go into, but this artist has successfully incorporated, is the idea of using complementary colors. So again, if you've attended one of our other webinars about color, orange and blue are complementary colors. So there's some really beautiful kind of blue spots happening here where it really has no place in this composition. It's not really natural to have flecks of blue, but they've included it intentionally because they know that it offsets just the saturation or the dominance of yellow and orange in the composition. So that's really beautiful. That's something that we definitely take advantage of in science illustration as well, is incorporating complementary colors to highlight certain regions of your figure. So just kind of keep this at the back of your mind as we go through the next few slides here. So looking at this figure, this was kind of generously contributed by Dr. Daisy Xu from Harvard Medical School. And what I did was I actually took this figure and I started to look at what areas are really striking about this. So in my mind, my eye goes straight to the highest contrast, highest saturation of color. And that's really in this area, sort of this TGF beta with red phosphate little circles. Now, if I were to take this exact same figure and move that saturation somewhere else, you'll notice a really drastic, significant difference. Literally exact same figure, but all I've done is recolored the proteins around the DNA in the nucleus, and immediately my eye goes there first. So again, think of it as a painter painting a still life. Where are the flowers right now? For figure 2, it's really focusing in the DNA. And like this is kind of, a really powerful tool you can use to draw your grant reviewer's eye to the area that you need them to look first. If this is your main story, if this is what you're spending, 8 years of your life on, and you really want them to look here because this is where the magic is happening, use color as a way to attract their eye there, kind of like bees to a flower. So if I were to take this step even further, I thought I'd just do one really short demo here to prove this even further. So I can take this figure. By the way, this is again a template available in BioRender. I'm going to subdue these protein colors a bit, just knock them back into the background because, my research maybe doesn't focus on this area. I could even reduce the opacity of the DNA so it's almost a softer color. And don't be afraid to play with opacity either. This is like a designer's best friend, is we're always up in the opacity drop down, playing with different opacities, because it also offers different colors in a way. Say my focus was, I don't know, these 3 proteins. If you make that contrast really, really high, that intensity of the color, and it doesn't have to be red, it could just be, wherever it is that has that highest intensity. I'm going to export again here, low resolution to my desktop, and I'm going to come back here to my slide deck. Oh, sorry, Zoom is slowing down my app here. There we go. I'm going to go over to my next slide and insert that in, and you'll see here how dramatic it is. So I've literally changed where I can focus your eye, literally based on the intensity of the saturation, the contrast, again, kind of like the flowers of the plant. So I hope that's informative and helpful when thinking about how to color your figures. It's also worth noting that, we've kind of monochromatically chosen background elements to be similar. So we're not picking every color of the rainbow. You want most of your figure to be almost similar in hue, and then punch up the areas where you think are really important to highlight. Okay? So again, exact same figures, different areas of focus. And that leads me to the next point here, is the idea of poor contrast This is probably, again, one of the top mistakes we see across the board, not just grant figures, but publications, posters, your thesis work. It really has to do with the fact that colors are very difficult to work with. And so what we have in BioRender is this really handy convert to grayscale function. And so something like this that looked okay, if you now convert to grayscale, we're losing a lot of information. So this double-stranded DNA now looks single-stranded in the T cell nucleus. The apoptosis label is now completely obliterated. And this is important for many reasons. Sometimes your grant reviewers will actually print out your application on a printer. Obviously, there's a huge population of colorblind audiences, and that could mean one of your grant reviewers. And then in general, it actually is really difficult to see, but it's hard to know until you remove color as a variable. Oh, if I were to pop over to BioRender again and open up this figure that has poor contrast, in just a few minutes here, I'm going to fix this up. So let's pick a much darker color. Let's see, I'm actually going to show you that really handy preview in grayscale, which is this kind of, it looks like a little sunset icon on the right here. So converting to grayscale, turning it on and off. Maybe what I'll do is knock back the opacity of this cell. Again, don't be afraid to play with the opacity a little bit. Now the cancer cell is really red. I maybe don't want it that red. This is probably sufficient. And this label, we want it to be nice and dark. You could even go the opposite and make it white, but I'm going to make it black. Okay, it is low opacity. I was wondering why it wasn't dark enough. Okay, there we go. And then this DNA, if we check again, quick gut check, still looking quite camouflaged. So you can see here, it pops right away if I pick a darker saturation color. There we go. So looking much better. I'm actually going to just quickly screenshot this. It's going to be very low res, unfortunately, but just to speed it up here. Much higher contrast. Actually, I'm going to also bring in the black and white version just so you can see that difference. So if you kind of toggle between the poor contrast version and the high contrast version, much easier to see. And even as professionals, sometimes we'll run at BioRender, we'll run our art critiques totally in black and white, as if we're going back in time to, before we had color TVs, because that just forces us to make sure that we have enough contrast in the figure. Again, if you remove color as a variable in your figure making. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Another really important factor is you don't want your grant reviewer scratching their head trying to squint and read your labels. That's not where you want to lose them. All right, so the last kind of 3 tips here will whiz by a little bit. Space-saving tips. This is specific, I'd say, to maybe grant figures and perhaps even graphical abstracts. Those figures that you feel like have to be summaries, and sometimes you feel the need to put a lot of information, although you should really try to limit the content. If you are stuck with having to show a lot of content, there are some things you can use, some tricks to make sure that you optimize the space. It can also feel like living in a 500 square foot apartment and trying to make use of every square inch. That's often what I feel like, what it feels like to be making grant figures, especially because I think I measured this out. It's almost the size of a business card sometimes in real life if you were to print out your grant figure. Again, if you're limited by space and if it has to fit within, an 8.5 by 11 kind of real estate. So here are a couple tips that you can incorporate. One is basically to use negative space as your best friend in the areas between your columns, your sections. We've already gone through this before, where kind of that rule of proximity really helps. And it avoids the need to use boxes. Sometimes you'll want to put stuff in boxes so that it can be closely associated with each other. The boxes themselves actually take up a lot of room and visual noise. So if you utilize empty space and negative space very well, that will save you that extra space. Here's an example in practice. So we actually took this figure and kind of drew boxes around it and realized, this particular, I guess this is a publication figure, not a grant image, but same principle applies here of kind of visualizing what those boxes would look like if we were to kind of box in each step. And then all we did was rearrange those boxes to be a little more neat, kind of like tidying up your room, making sure that that negative space in between is kind of held true across the entire composition. Now, it's not perfect, as you can see. It's a little tighter in some areas, but as long as it's generally consistent, it does make a world of a difference. So again, going from here to here, and then removing those boxes, those elements actually create those visual hallways, if you can see, without having to write those lines. And of course, throwing in some nice bold numbers, that helps significantly. A couple of other tips here. I could probably talk all day about using arrows properly, but this is a nice way to start to eliminate some of those, elements that are unnecessary, like label lines, for example. Sometimes you don't need to shoot an arrow from your words to the object it's labeling. What you could do sometimes is kind of color pick the title or the word or the label to the thing that you're labeling. And again, some of you who have attended our previous webinars know that we kind of like to use this trick in a lot of our templates. You do want to make sure that the color of the label is dark enough. I probably would have gone a little bit darker in this case for the disintegrating microtubule label. But you can see we were able to eliminate the arrow. And imagine your figure was full of these arrows. It becomes really confusing as to what is a label line, what's an action arrow, what is a state change. So really think about that. Maybe you can take this opportunity to remove some of the lines and arrows in your figure. Here's another kind of simple trick. I think a lot of you may do this already, is just stick the label right on top of the object. Again, make sure you have a high enough contrast. And if it's a textured object like this protein, maybe you'll want to add kind of like a translucent white box or something like that behind the word that can, bump up the contrast of the text against that textured background. So again, another space saving tip there. And then this is one of my favorites, is the famous circle crop that we have in BioRender. If you didn't know we have it, it's a really handy tool. Basically, blow up the area that you want to kind of zoom into, and then basically circle crop it using our crop function. And then I would draw like kind of a stroke around that crop just to kind of, nest it in. And a really nice way to save space. Sometimes you don't need the tail ends of this axon here, and you just want the synapse area. Really nice way to circle crop it. It's also a nice way to kind of zoom in and out without losing that sense of dimension or size. Because when you're changing scale, it can be a little bit confusing as to, how far zoomed in am I? This is a way to kind of fake that by just kind of circling the area that you're zooming into. And then, it doesn't have to look one-to-one, as long as you're kind of roughly associating that this circle crop kind of relates to that mini circle in the background. So again, another way to save space in your grant figures. And I can demo this when we go back into the app. Okay, so last two tips here, keys and legends to use or not to use. We get this question a lot, and they can be your best friend or your worst enemy, depending on how well you use it. I pulled this diagram from a presentation that I found, and I think it did a great job of comparing, different steps, so A, B, C. One thing that I would have done differently here, And I think one mistake that we do see in using legends is that the symbols start to become a little too close to each other. So, it's like using letters in an alphabet, and the letters are so close that it's difficult to read the sentence. That you end up doing a lot of back and forth. So if I were to use, again, our trusty little highlighter here, it kind of does this where, I start at A, and this looks really cool, but I want to know what it is. So I'm going to come down here and look at that. And I go back up, B, and then what are these little red things? Okay, it's down here. And then is this the same as what I saw earlier? This is the same as that. Okay. And now what about these? There's this pink thing with green stuff in it. I think that's down here. This red thing is back here. And I know this looks ridiculous, but this is actually what your eye is doing. So this is why it's, when you see a figure and it's busy and your eye gets strained, this is literally because your eye is trying to focus on that, those flower petals. You're trying to find it because our eyes are craving a focal point, and it's not able to find that, let alone understand the symbols. So, our recommendation is, of course, to try to use images in your key or legend, if you do go with a key or a legend, that are far enough apart from each other that you don't have to do that back and forth. There's a couple more examples. I think this one did an okay job, but again, the symbols are starting to look quite similar, so it becomes very hard to do that back and forth to see, what does this stand for? What does this stand for? By that point, it's probably worth just labeling, on the object. And I would also argue that the first image that I showed here probably has maybe too many elements in its legend. And then, yeah, same goes for this third image. I'd say the worst offender here is kind of that contrast in there of the GPI anchored protein, that pink element. I'd probably have made that, much darker. This is an extreme example of glycans, so they do a pretty good job, in glycobiology and basically having very, very clear colors and symbols. I mean, if you can get to this level of symbolism, great. I know it's not always possible, but this is probably the direction at which you'd like to strive. So here's an image I'd like to do a super quick makeover for. This was a figure, again, generously contributed by, I'm going to get his name right here, Dr. Matthew Swire. Now, this image actually, I think I'm still in black and white mode. There we go. This image was much better when he submitted it. I just kind of fudged it a little bit to make it not successful so we can go through this demo together. But I look at this figure, quite typical of, say, a grant figure where you're trying to show kind of outcomes of one step, or again, a fork in the road. And I think if I look at this again as a painter, there's a lot of flowers in this scene. I don't quite know where to focus my eye. There is hierarchy, which is great. And this might be an opportunity where we could bring in a legend or some sort of key. So one thing I would do is, what is the main part of the story? And it looks like the main idea is to show kind of how the action potentials should arrive at the same time. And that is clearly shown here very nicely with these orange arrows. So if you squint and try to focus on the yellow, very nicely shown here in the top where it kind of stops or is kind of delayed on this neuron versus the bottom one. And then in the subsequent images, they arrive at the engaged neuron at the same time. So let's start to clean up this figure a little bit. What I'm going to do is zoom in and start to remove some of these unnecessary arrows, like so. I think because we're going to use a legend, I'm going to start to remove some of these labels as well. So I have kind of like a cooking show, a pre-made legend. I'm just going to drag over for the sake of time. There we go. And so I've got my key players there. So I'm going to start to eliminate some of our labels. There we go. So already looking a little bit cleaner. Maybe even this action potential I can remove. Looking much more open. And again, we're zoomed in here, but imagine this was, this size. I think removing those labels was almost necessary for us. Okay. And that's another thing painters do, actually. If you go into a studio, they're constantly moving up to the canvas and then literally walking across the room. It's actually it's a good workout when you're painting, because you're literally walking across the room every 5 minutes to see how it registers at a distance. We should kind of make sure to do that with our grant figures, because again, they probably will be shrunk down. But in any case, we've got this going. Color. So let's kind of mute the colors for the key players here that maybe aren't key players. So this new oligodendrocyte, purple's a pretty bold color to just introduce here when it might not be the main part of the story. So let's go up here to BioRender's sort of select all same icon function, so I don't have to go around and click them all. Oh, it's actually the same icon as the other. So you know what? I'm just going to hand shift select a bunch of those. Why don't we make this just like a dark green? So it's kind of similar to the existing oligodendrocyte color. Again, if you want to make these ones a little bit different, maybe we reduce the opacity a little. You can see me kind of playing with that. But you kind of want to stick to the same family of color, so that you're not introducing kind of like, petals, again, leaf petals on a flower. We want to focus our eye on the flower of our still life. Oligodendrocyte progenitor. Also probably not the main part of our story. Again, they're important, but they're not the main part. So maybe we even go with a green. Because the shape of this object is different enough, I think it's worth the risk here of going with the green color. Okay, so just by doing this, now my eye is shooting right down to the engaged neuron and the traveling action potential. If I zoom out, I hope you can all see that too, how that change was pretty drastic, and just by subduing the colors a little bit. Another trick I would do is think about your legend. If you are using a legend, maybe it needs a label here, just a legend. Think of it as when you're watching a movie, the cast of characters actually appears usually in order of appearance in the movie. And so that's how I like to think about the legend, is order the players, or the, I guess, characters of the story by order in which they appear. So this new oligodendrocyte, this character doesn't show up until, scene 3 down here. So probably not worth talking about just yet. I'd say the first character here is the cortical neuron. So let's move it up here. Maybe we can bring up this as well. I think this is a good order. Also, when you have objects that are relatively close in shape or color, I would put those side by side so that that difference is much more obvious, like so. So that's looking pretty good. I also, very small adjustment here, I'd probably reduce the intensity of this box around the legend. I know that's a minor thing, but it's not really a step in the process. It's kind of a nice to have off to the side. So let's de-emphasize that a little bit. Maybe I'll even make the shape a little bit different. So again, my eye knows that, okay, this is not a step in the process. It's kind of like a, side note. Cool. I think that's looking pretty good. Let's move out. Great. And again, just for brevity's sake, I'm going to take a low res screenshot here, and let's see the difference. So before, quite busy, tons of flowers in our scene. We want to focus on maybe one main part of the story. And there we go, much cleaner. And this would, so before and after, pretty subtle changes if you think about what we did and the time we took, but pretty drastic in the clarity of the story. Okay. So final tip here is to put it all into context. I kind of try to think of an analogy of why this is so important. And it's kind of like, I don't know if you've seen this before online, but I think it's hilarious when people buy things on Amazon or online and they think they're getting a huge deal because it's super cheap compared to the alternative products. And then when it arrives, it's actually like a miniature doll-sized version of it. And this is kind of how I think about grant figures. I know it's kind of a stretch, but if you think about those objects and kind of the trade-offs of what they had to eliminate to be able to register at that size, that's kind of how I'd love for you to think about grant figures. They don't need to put everything that the full-size version would have, basically. So think of it that way. Again, your figure, if I were to show you in practice, this sized figure, it has to be able to be legible at this size, not at the size on the left. This is totally fine if you're presenting on an overhead or maybe a big auditorium one day when we're all back at conferences. But for grants, it's really going to be probably much smaller. I'm sure some grants might allow for half-size figures, in which case you're fine. But from what I understand, a lot of the times they do get shrunk down. So make sure your text is legible, minimum, I think 8-point font. That's actually the minimum in standard design practices for making business cards. Anything beyond that, they're not going to be able to call you or know your name because it's too small to read. So just always put into context. This is kind of that final gut check, and I guess in the last few minutes here, I want to leave you with this message. I found this on Twitter right after we gave our last webinar, which I loved. Writers, all do figures at the end. Reviewers, all review figures at the start. So for some reason, I know it's probably something you want to put off till the end because it's scary. Figure making is not, everyone's forte. But the reality is that reviewers, both for grants and for journals, they tend to look at the figures first because it's the easiest thing to look at. It's the hardest thing to draw or do, but it's the easiest thing to look at. So they'll go there. And admittedly, I've talked to a lot of grant reviewers when I've gone to conferences specific to, research development. They admit that sometimes they'll only look at the figure and go on to the next because they've only got a certain number of minutes in their day. They're going to optimize that by trying to get the most bang for their buck. And that ends up being, unfortunately, looking at the figures and, moving on to the next if they can't understand the message. So the takeaway here is just to not save it till the end. Get a fresh pair of eyes on it, maybe a colleague, a non-scientist friend to look at it, see if they can understand the story, see if it looks busy. If it feels busy, try to go back and use some of the tips we've talked about today. And don't be afraid to redo parts of the figure. That kind of lends itself to starting a little bit early if you can. Okay, so we're coming up on the hour here. I think we've covered a lot. I wanted to thank you so much for sticking with us for the full hour. Also for joining us today. I know, we're all really busy and probably a bit zoomed out. So really hope you enjoyed this. And if you have suggestions for other types of webinars you'd like to see, go ahead and request those in the chat. We'd also love for you to try out the app itself, of course. So go ahead and use the link that I believe Cindy has already linked. I don't think it went to the entire audience here, so I'm going to relink it there. Go ahead and use that link to sign up for your own account. Great news is that BioRender is free to use if you're making a grant figure. So if you have the subscription version, even better, because it unlocks a lot of really cool features that will help you in the figure making endeavor. But if you have the free version and that's good enough for you, you're welcome to use that for your grant submissions. Of course, for journal publications, you do require a subscription tier, as well as for, requesting special custom icons, which we didn't get into for this webinar, but if you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe. I think it's at least an annual subscription, but you get to lock into our custom medical illustration studio. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you again so much for joining. I hope you'll give BioRender a try if you haven't already. And if you're a BioRender veteran, hopefully you picked up a couple of new tips. And then thank you to the BioRender team for sticking around and answering all of the questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to a proper Q&A session, but it looks like a lot of the questions were answered. So I guess we will take this opportunity to sign off, and thank you again for joining. And look out for follow-up emails for more webinars like this. Great. All right, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe. Thanks for joining.